Professor R. Shep Melnick teaches American politics at Boston College, and he's also one of the co-chair of the program on constitutional government at Harvard University, along with the great Harvey Mansfield. He's joining us today to discuss a short article that he wrote, published in Quillette, titled "The Political Foundations of the DOGE or DOGE Scam." Shep, welcome to the show. It's good to have you here. How are you?
Thanks for having me.
So, I should like to begin by asking you, what do you believe is the proper role of the government in American public life?
That's obviously a very big, complicated, and important question. The, there are many roles. Obviously, the central role is to keep citizens safe from foreign attack. So defense is crucial to maintain law and order. So you have to start with that. Um, to these days, kind of keep markets operating fairly, which means that um, you have to create some stability in finance. You have to make sure that markets are transparent. You have to deal with externalities. So there are all kinds of forms of regulation, from the rules about the financial markets to the stock market to environmental regulation to consumer safety laws. So that's a second big area. I think we've decided in this country and almost all other uh, liberal democracies that we have to provide a certain amount of economic security to people so that they'll have enough to retire. If they have huge health bills, they'll be able to pay for that. And that people who are uh, facing serious poverty um, can get some help from government. So the welfare state, we can debate how big that is, but it's really, I think we've decided that's crucial. And of course, education, that we rely upon government to educate our citizens, and without proper levels of education, everything else falls. And we need to be concerned in the United States that we are not doing very well with poor children, um, and the gap between the rich and the poor for education has been getting worse. And finally, I'd add that we need to protect against various forms of discrimination, especially in the United States, racial discrimination, but other forms of discrimination as well. We can debate all the extent of all of those things and how we do it. But I think as a kind of as a basic commitment, those areas are very solid. And a few people might disagree, but I don't think very many.
Okay. Well, I'd like to follow up with that by asking, so would Elon Musk and the people working at the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE as it's called, uh, would they have anything to disagree with what you've just answered?
An excellent question, and I wish I knew the answer because I think um, probably some of them would. Some of them are probably pretty committed libertarians. So they would want a much smaller welfare state. They would want more privatization um, of education. They would want less regulation. And on some of those issues, more or less, I think that they might have um, a point, unless they would say we should just get out of this stuff altogether. Now, I think that the difficulty, and this really goes to, in part, to my article that you referred to, is that if they believe that almost all the money we are spending on Social Security and on food stamps and on Medicare and Medicaid is um, the result of fraud, waste, abuse, and inefficiency, I will say categorically they are wrong. This is a myth. The Social Security Administration that runs the old age and survivors insurance has an extremely small administrative cost and has very little fraud, waste, and abuse. You can find a little bit here or there. That's why those guys have had to exaggerate vastly. So, um, if you think that all of the things we are doing in all of these areas are simply wasteful, and that there are no big questions about whether we should do more or less. That is a very serious mistake. I think it is a fraud. I think it's a myth.
Okay. Well, those who are more sympathetic to what Musk and DOGE are doing would say that, well, they're basically fulfilling the kind of rhetoric that Ronald Reagan proposed in the 80s. He would say, "What are the nine most dangerous words in the English language? I'm from the
Sure.
government and I'm here to help." 11 if you don't count the contractions. Uh, and he did say that, government is not the solution, government is the problem. So
Sure.
they're just fulfilling it, four or so decades later. If
Sure.
Reagan formed DOGE or a version of it, then I would imagine that many conservatives would be on board.
Okay. Um, and I will say that since Reagan was elected in 1980, the size of the federal government has grown enormously. Um, Healthcare spending has grown enormously, retirement benefits, means tested programs, regulation of the environment. So if you are a thoughtful conservative, then you're going to be very concerned about this extent of growth of government. Now, what Reagan did, and here, I never voted for Reagan, but I think that, but I respect him, and I think that he did some of the causes that he promoted were important ones. Think about how he did it. He did two things, I think, to cut the size of government. He supported legislation, especially in 1981 and 1982, to cut funding to various programs. So he went through the constitutionally mandated process of Congress changing spending levels. He was partially successful in that, although the spending went up after 1982. The other thing he did was to really empower an office within Office of Management and Budget um, that looked at all of the new regulations coming down the pike and tried to see which of these are cost effective and which aren't. And he, I would say, on the margins, reduced the cost of regulation that way. I think both of those things were very sensible. However, what is DOGE doing right now? It is trying to um, eliminate programs mandated by Congress with that have appropriations and we're going to do this unilaterally with presidential power. Congress not going to be involved. They are cutting members of the civil service who have been funded and created by Congress, unilaterally doing that. They are not using constitutional mechanisms. And that's why they're losing so many court cases, because most of what they're doing is simply contrary to law. Laws passed by Congress. If you don't like these programs, get Congress to change them. But of course, they can't get Congress to change them because these programs are very politically popular.
Um, do you give any credence to the notion that maybe the so-called deep state is fighting back against Donald Trump, a crusader against, government bureaucratic entrenchment?
Let me, I find this term, the deep state, deeply misleading. I've said it various other times, and I've studied the so-called administrative state. And two things I'd like to point out is that the deep state isn't very deep, and the administrative state isn't very administrative. And by what I mean by that is that most of the programs that conservatives are concerned about, and to some extent those on the left should be concerned about, are not the result of bureaucratic aggrandizement. They are the result of number one, congressional action, number two, judicial action, number three, demands from interest groups. So to blame all of this on the so-called deep state, I think, is to misunderstand the origin of these programs and what we need to do to trim them in a responsible manner. And I think all of this rhetoric about the deep state has led to profound misunderstanding of what these programs do. And it has been over the last 8 years, it has been infected by Donald Trump's uh, desire for retribution against people who opposed him. As you can see, I am very sympathetic to some of the claims that we need to reduce the power of administrative regulations. And I've written extensively about this, criticize the regulations, especially under Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. But you have to see that these are the results of congressional action and inaction, court action. And I just will want to point out that in the first Trump administration, the Title IX regulations that were so heavily criticized by Republicans and often for good reason were substantially reformed by the Office of Civil Rights in a very reasonable, responsible, legal way. And the so-called deep state did a very good job of creating better regulations.
Yes, I actually wrote a research paper, as a school project, regarding the Reagan era and how, despite his rhetoric about kind out government, the budget that's required and also the national deficit of government still rose.
Sure.
Um, so yes, I take your point in that. I would like to also mention, assuming that you're a big public interest, national affairs reader, like I am, there's an article that Senator Moynihan, or I believe he was just Professor Moynihan, wrote in the 1960s called The Professionalization of Reform,
Yep.
in which he observed that many of the programs that are designed to benefit poor people ended up uh, being more beneficial to the people who are working for
Yep.
that program.
Yep.
They're government bureaucrats who have middle income salary and such. So most of the funding goes to them rather than goes to the people that the program is intended to help. So
Mhm.
to what
Yeah.
extent is Moynihan's observation still true?
Sure. That's an excellent article. I recommend that everyone read it. Pat Moynihan was the greatest senator of the last 100 years and a really great scholar. Um, he so when Moynihan was writing, that was the late 60s, early 70s. Um, that was the time when we were still in thrall of the Great Society programs, which tended to focus much more on providing services than on providing income. Uh, I think first thing I would say is that over time, I think that emphasis has changed dramatically. So today, almost all of the money that goes to means tested programs, that is, programs that go to poor families, has been switched to transfer payments or to healthcare. So if you look at what are the biggest expenditures for means tested programs to poor families these days, number one is the food stamp program that basically is pretty close to a cash transfer. Second is the earned income tax credit, which is a cash transfer. The other huge area is medicine. Um, and of course, a lot of the money that goes into Medicare and Medicaid goes into providers. It goes to doctors, hospitals, nurses, um, often not directly, often through insurance. And if you include those people as providers, there's huge amount of spending and there's a huge amount of inefficiency in that program. But I don't think we'd want to say that we want to reduce the number of doctors and nurses and technicians. If anything, I'd say what we need to do is vastly increase the number of healthcare providers because, especially the AMA and others have tried to protect their interests by keeping the number of entries down. Obviously, anyone who studies economics, you depress supply and you increase demand, you're going to increase prices. Um, So there is, I think, something to that in the healthcare area. The other thing I would just say, and I think this is an important thing to understand, is that where are these social service providers? They are not employed by the federal government. So if you reduce the size of the federal workforce, you're not going to touch them. They are at state and local governments. They are contractors. Um, and who is in charge of trying to make sure that those people are doing their job and their costs are not excessive? People in the federal civil service, and to the extent they reduce the number of people in the federal civil service, the amount of oversight is going to decrease. And I would just encourage your readers to read a National Affairs article by John DiIulio, I think it came out in 2012, basically showing the fact that of the all the people who live off federal grants and federal contracts and federal money, federal employees are just a very small part of that. Most of them are contractors, state and local governments, um, people receiving federal grants.
Yes. The article is titled "Facing Up to Big Government," but yeah, John DiIulio Jr. I believe he's still at UPenn. I
Yes.
got a
Yep.
chance to read it, and it's been mentioned in your Colette piece as well. It's very much worth reading in the observations that he made that, well, big government is here to stay, and we just kind of have to deal with it. Um, so
And he
yeah.
has a book from Brookings called "Bring Back the Bureaucrats," uh, which is the opposite of DOGE. He says all of these things that we're farming out to other people would run more efficiently and more accountably if we brought them back within the purview of the federal civil service.
Mhm. Okay. Well, as someone who admires William Buckley, and I'm told that this is his centenary. He was born in 1925. The goal of the conservative movement is to roll back government. So,
Mhm.
I mean, if we are to admit, like Professor Giulio, that, well, that is an impossible task, then should conservatives just admit defeat, or should they focus on other projects than, reducing the size of government?
I would encourage them to stick to the plan um, and to prune government where it's excessive. And there are lots of areas where it is excessive. I have argued that in many forms of civil rights regulation, we have gone way too far. Um, various forms of environmental regulation, that's the case. Here, and I would say here's why conservatives really can't abandon that project, and it is because we can't pay for all of the things we are committed to doing right now. Um, the size of the federal deficit is enormous. Um, when David Stockman in 1980 claimed that we were facing an economic Dunkirk because of the size of the deficit, it was a fraction of what it is now. We can, as Herb Stein said, anything that can't go on like this forever won't. Um, we're going to have to cut spending, and this is the part that conservatives won't like. We're going to have to raise taxes. Um, and we have their crucial things that I think everyone would agree we have to spend money on. National defense, um, policing, education, um, and those things will continue to be expensive. So what I would encourage conservatives to do is to be discriminating in the areas in which there are places that we can find excesses, inefficiencies, especially in healthcare, and admit that the welfare state is here to stay, admit we need to raise taxes and take a pragmatic way of trying to get our demands on government in alignment with what we're willing to pay for it.
So what has Elon's department, DOGE, managed to accomplish, or hasn't managed to accomplish, in the months since Trump has been elected the second time?
Sure. I mean, I think it's going to take many, many more months for us to figure out what it has accomplished. Um, Number one, we don't know that because so many of these things have been overturned by courts. Um, we don't know which of those court orders will be upheld in the long run. I suspect that most of them will. Um, so that's one source of uncertainty. The other source of uncertainty is what happens when you fire lots of employees? Um, are you going to decimate these agencies, or are you eventually going to bring them back and try to rebuild? I fear that there's going to be long-term harm done to many of these agencies, especially research organizations. Um, and I think as conservatives should recognize this, I think that this maxim, which is institutions are hard to build but easy to destroy. And if you destroy these organizations, it's going to be hard to rebuild them. So that's a second source of uncertainty of what's going to happen to these employees. Third source of uncertainty is what Congress is going to do. And I think the most interesting thing to watch over the next several months is that in all of these areas in which DOGE and Musk and Trump said we want to eliminate these programs, these are terrible programs, what's Congress going to do? Is it going to eliminate them? My guess, the answer is no. So you're going to have this big conflict between what Congress does and what the administration through DOGE and Elon Musk claimed they were trying to do. So I'd look at what happens to court decisions, what happens to rebuilding the agencies, and what happens to the appropriations that are passed by Congress coming up.
So one of the programs that is scheduled to be on the proverbial chopping block is the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID.
Yep.
Um, so I suppose even if the USAID survives or doesn't, there's still questions, so to speak, in regards to how it operates.
Yep.
You know, aside from the fact that generally Americans tend to be against foreign aid, uh, there's a case to be made that the operations of that agency and maybe other agencies or institutions within American government, say the National Endowment for Democracy, has done certain programs that are at best morally questionable or politically questionable or at worst ineffective. So, how would you give a defense of maintaining these agencies?
Sure. First, I'll say that, I think that what um, some programs within AID, and perhaps I'm not sure, um, the National Endowment for Democracy. Um, you know, many of these programs were, I think, adversely affected by the kind of political correctness instituted during the Biden administration. And I'm sure you can find many examples in these agencies, as you can find all over academia, of really extreme positions. So if the Trump administration went after those and said, okay, we're going to prune those, we're going to go back to the way these agencies were operating during the George W. Bush administration. I could understand that. I would probably applaud that. But the idea that then you just dismantle these organizations, um, agents spend a relatively small part of the federal budget trying to reduce AIDS and disease in Africa, um, trying to promote the values of liberal democracy through Voice of America, which is being attacked by the Trump administration. To do all of these things on with the kind of the claim that political correctness has invaded everything, which is clearly not true, um, is, yeah, I think, an abomination, is hurting our soft power abroad, is making an opening to China to make inroads in these countries. And it is, I would say it is part of, I mean, here I will be very blunt. I think it is part of the isolationist view that we can somehow just remove ourselves from the rest of the world, which is undoing peace and prosperity that the United States has promoted through alliances and through foreign policy since World War II. And it is, if, I've got to say, I think it's part of Trump and Musk's authoritarian impulse that they simply don't like this idea of promoting uh, constitutional liberal democracy abroad because, they would rather do deals with dictators rather than promote this principles the United States has stood for ever since the revolution.
Yes. Yeah, I
So
currently live in.
that might be a little bit more of a polemical argument than you expected, but I obviously feel very strongly about the way in which this administration is trying to retreat from the world.
Yes. Yeah, so do I. But I'm also living in Hungary, where the current prime minister is very much against the kind of American soft power that you've just described. But he's also very how do you call it, welcoming or susceptible to Chinese soft power,
That's
given the
exactly the problem. You put your finger right on it.
yes, given the increasing number of like Chinese people who are moving in here and buying property
Interesting.
here.
Interesting.
Yes, I guess a case can be made, so to speak, that uh, well, dealing with dictators, and I'm not saying I'm making this case, but I'm saying that there is a case to be made that um, dictators do not question your internal um, way of running the government, and that's why currently Hungary is using every opportunity that it could, at least from Budapest, the government, to trash talk the European Union because they're trying to tell Hungary how to run its government in regards to certain minorities and LGBTQ plus population, whereas well the Russians and the Chinese just do business with us and they don't tell us what to do or what kind of policy to administer. Um, so how would you, I guess, challenge this position?
Yeah, I mean, um, I think Putin has tried to affect domestic American politics. So they might do more things more subtly than the United States and the EU do. Um, and foreign policy can't be run entirely on principle. Um, that we have to look at it for our national interest. We have to concern with spheres of influence and the extent of our military power and the limits of it. That's all undeniable. The Kissinger realpolitik had a lot of merit to it. But I've never understood why that had to completely drive out any concern for um, the behavior of other countries, because we know that authoritarian countries, the more authoritarian, the more expansionist they are, the more likely they are to upset the status quo and to invade other countries. So we have an interest in promoting um, uh, liberalization and liberal democracy abroad, both for national interest reasons and for principled reasons. It doesn't mean that we've got to realize that we have limited power to do these things. We could, we thought that we could somehow just bring liberal democracy on the back of the tank to Iraq. That was obviously only wishful thinking. But I don't think these things are incompatible.
Okay. So finally, a quick word.
Sure.
Since you are co-chair of the program on constitutional government at Harvard, so how would you make the case for constitutional government?
Sure. Well, you give me another hour and a half. What what we're seeing right now is the claim that um, president elected by almost a majority of the people should have complete control over the government, and that Congress, the courts, should just step aside. Um, and what I said, that is kind of the pure majoritarian democratic argument. And that's the argument that Tocqueville thought was most dangerous about democracy. So what I'd say about the nature of constitutional government is two things. First, it creates various legal forms that need to be respected, and that is, you know, uh, once money is appropriated, it has to be spent. Um, if you're going to deport people, you have to give them due process of law. That the executive branch is charged with faithfully executing the law and not faithfully executing the whim of the president. Um, so there are forms that need to be respected to protect individual rights, individual liberty, individual um, interests. Number two, that the nature of a constitutional democracy is to promote pluralism. That is multiple sources of authority. So you will have these areas of protection for individual rights and individual differences, and uh, pluralism, respect for rights, respect for the rule of law, limitations on the power of anyone. That's what, you read the Federalist Papers, that's what it's all about. You read Tocqueville, that's what he thinks that a well-constituted liberal democracy should promote. And I think that is what is under threat today.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Shep Melnick, for joining the show.
Good. Thanks for having me.